Hey everyone, this is one of my favorite lectures of the semester. This is about the three kinds of paragraphs. This is going to be instructional not only in terms of thinking about how to write papers, but also in looking at grading, looking at the rubrics, right? Particularly with the intro paragraphs and the conclusion paragraph section. We're going to get right into talking about intro paragraphs, and I break this up into three different presentations just because this is long compared to some of the other lecturette videos you're going to get, especially this first one. There's just a lot of ground to cover with intro paragraphs in particular. So we're going to go ahead, jump right into that, and start with the first slide here after the title slide, which is, importantly, you want to not think of a paper as one single giant hard to write paper. You want to think about this series of linked paragraphs that work together. That makes it much easier in your organization, and it also makes it just easier to write because you're not thinking about, oh, it's 1,500 words, it's going to be so hard, I've got to bring in these sources. Instead, you're thinking, okay, here's a 200 to 250 word intro paragraph that needs to build towards introducing my thesis statement. Here's a body paragraph that needs to deal with this particular facet of my paper. And so if you think about it in terms of those kind of considerations, those word lengths, and the specific jobs that each paragraphs have to do, you're going to have a lot better time writing your paper, and it's going to hopefully translate into better organization and more cohesion. So let's talk about the intro paragraph. And the intro paragraph has three jobs. First of all, you're going to want to engage the reader. You want the text to be interesting. You want to make sure that you are hooking the reader and wanting the reader to look at the rest of your paper. Of course, in the case of an academic paper, I am primarily your audience for that. So I am going to read straight through to the end no matter what, because that is my job and I'm coaching you in your writing. But you want to also think about your classmates as audience members. And so you want to think about how would I captivate them? How would I keep their interest throughout the whole thing? You also want to establish the voice, right? You want the text to be appropriate. Again, an academic paper, it's a rhetorical situation that's a little bit more formal than, say, if you were writing an email to a classmate or a text to a close friend, right? And then most importantly, you want to introduce the thesis, right? You want your text to be purposeful. Your paper is going to have a specific task, and that thesis statement is going to reveal how you are approaching that. So you do want to start with the topic, right? You don't want the thesis to be the very first thing that your reader sees. So in this case, we're talking about immigration to the US. This is a complex issue that involves the economy, human rights, and our nation's values and history. It can go in a lot of different directions, but in our case, we're going to talk about the aspect of the topic. Again, immigration reform, there's a lot of different aspects. There's a lot of different ways that you could focus a paper like that, a lot of different kind of areas within immigration. We're going to talk about immigration reform in particular, namely a path that allows for undocumented immigrants to gain American citizenship. And then you are ready to present the thesis once you've got the topic and the aspect handled. So that should do two main things, right? You want to present your specific argument to the reader, and then you also want to provide your reader a sense of the paper structure. And that's something that's really helpful and useful when you're writing your paper, because what that's going to do is that's not only going to let the audience know what's coming, but as you're writing it, it's going to give you a roadmap. It's going to give you structure. It's going to give you the sort of organization that you need to build the body paragraphs. So we've got a sample thesis statement here. And again, this is a proposal paper, which I do in some of my classes. So you may run across this later in the semester. I argue, right? So again, you're taking ownership, so you can use I. That is perfectly fine. You are arguing, right? You are making a argument based on evidence and pushing for a certain position. In this case, in the United States, you have to pick an entity in this paper, like the United States or Texas or Austin or San Antonio. Should reform current immigration laws to allow undocumented immigrants a path to citizenship. So that is your actual proposal. That's what you were calling for. And then this paper requires three distinct, clear outcomes that you would create as a result of doing this. So it would allow them to participate more fully in American society, will boost our economy, will honor our history as a nation of immigrants. And what that does is that creates, again, they're in different colors to highlight that, yes, these are distinct, separate body paragraphs that you are then going to develop. So your reader knows where you're going, and as you're writing it, you know where you're going, which is great. And one does not simply think of an opening sentence for an essay. The idea with that is that you are actually going to want to write your thesis first as you prepare to write your paper. We're going to look at the opening strategies in a second here, and you'll see from that that some of those opening strategies, they are going to require some research. As you're writing your paper, you're obviously going to be doing research. Some of those are going to feed into your body paragraphs, but some of that can actually feed into your intro. Those can be really good for that, but you're not going to have those necessarily right away. So I would definitely suggest hierarchical things like your thesis statement, your topic sentences, getting the quotes together for the body paragraphs, and then making sure that you are writing to fit those. And we'll talk more about that process in the body paragraph section. So let's go with opening strategies. Again, we're trying to think about how we want to engage the reader and also establish our topic and our thesis. So a brief history is a good strategy if your topic is requiring some backstory to fully understand. If you want to change the status quo and your reader might not understand what that is, or if your topic is unfamiliar to the reader. Any of those things are good for bringing in a history. And let's see here. So I did some research in preparation for doing this. I put this together a few years ago, but I think a lot of this still applies. A lot of this still works, which is why I am doing this presentation now in 2020. So one of the things here that I like about these quotes, and again, you may want to paraphrase these. This might be long for direct quotes in a paper of this size. But one thing that this shows that I think is really useful is that we've had these kind of various levels of permissiveness and restrictiveness in our society, right? So with respects to immigration, there have been times where we've been more willing to let people in, and there have been times where we've been a little more wary of that, you could maybe say. So this shows that it's not just kind of one monolithic policy. It's something that oscillates a little bit between the two sides. And then an anecdote might be good, right? So a story involving an individual or a single situation, helping to illustrate the topic you're discussing. And I found this, I thought this was a particularly interesting story. So this is somebody who came over from the Bahamas as a 4-year-old. She's been functioning as an American citizen in a lot of different ways in Florida, but she is still an undocumented immigrant in her mid-30s. So if you're thinking about a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, this might be a person who would fit that. And then a quote, someone who can provide information about or insight into a particular topic. And I like this because, again, a former president is somebody who is, and actually he was the president at the time of this quote, so he's going to have obviously some good authority, right? So his ethos is pretty strong. He's somebody in a position of power and a position of knowledge, and plus he also, in this quote, spells out something pretty distinctly and simply that is a really good framework for a paper that's dealing with immigration reform, right? Because again, if this authority on this topic is saying the immigration system is broken, that directly, then that lends itself into talking about the need for reform. And then finally, statistics. So if you're dealing with people, if you're dealing with dollars, if you're dealing with measurements, that's all going to work really well to your advantage. Okay, so here's some statistics that I found from Center for American Progress, right? So we might get more recent things with the census coming up, although there are concerns that the census didn't quite do the job that it was supposed to do. But here we've got 40.7 million foreign-born people. We've got 11.3 million of them as unauthorized migrants. So that's a lot. That's a sizable number that we're dealing with, right? So we're not just talking about, oh, here's this issue that only affects a few thousand Americans and maybe it wouldn't necessarily be worth the investment of a proposal. This is something that affects a good chunk of the American populace, right? So in terms of who's living in the US, right? So, and then just these increases as well, that's kind of another thing that you could point to as there's a pressing need because there's more and more of this happening. So opening strategies that you want to avoid, one is the dictionary definition, right? So this is often a word that the reader knows, but immigration is defined as, that would be kind of an example of how that would be used here, right? So oftentimes that's used to try to broadly introduce the topic, but that can be way too broad and also kind of insulting your reader's intelligence in the process. So you're much better with something like a brief history or statistics if you're trying to establish just kind of general baseline things about immigration and how it appears. And then a too vague or a too general opening statement since the beginning of time is one that I've seen quite a bit in papers. Or, such and such has been a controversial issue for many years. Those are too vague, those are too general. If it's been controversial, you want to talk about how the controversy started. Like if you're talking about capital punishment, or if you're talking about abortion or something along those lines, where there's a landmark Supreme Court decision that is pertinent to how that's now a debate, it's probably just better to talk about that Supreme Court decision than to make some kind of vague statement about how it's been, since the beginning of time or for a long time or something along those lines. The more specific you can be on your intro, the better. All right, so that's going to conclude the introduction part of it. What you should do now is you should hop on over to the Body Paragraphs Lecturette and see part 2 of this 3-part presentation.